it's one of those days as an actor, you're just trying to get out of your own way because the material is so good, and you have 8 hours of relationship that you've created with your fellow actor, and you have to just trust your instincts at that point. And I feel like what Johnny does in that scene is like a level 10 degree of difficulty, because it would have been so easy to lean into making it overly sentimental or pushing it away, and it was so strong and earned and beautiful that all I had to do was watch you and react, really.
Thank you guys for joining us today for this screening, or tonight rather. Matt, I know that, as an executive producer, you have been involved in the project for, it must be like 4 years now, with Ron Nicewinder, the creator. Jonathan, at what point did you come on? And Matt, what was it that you saw in Jonathan that made you realize that he was the right person to play Tim?
I came on about 6 weeks before we started filming. So Matt had been with it. You've been with it for a good few years. Yeah. Matt was there right on the front line, getting it commissioned and all the pitch meetings. And I just jumped on a Zoom call and just debated whether to put a pair of glasses on for the chemistry read or not. So that was it. And then it all happened quite quickly.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you everybody for coming tonight. I know this is a beautiful summer night. We really appreciate your time here. Actually, our first Q&A we ever did for this show was here, and this is our last one. So it's really beautiful that we get to bring it full circle.
The very last one.
This is the last one. Yeah. I was fortunate enough to be, it's been about 4 years now, and Johnny was someone whose work I knew and was a fan of, and our mutual friend reminded me about his work very early on, like right when I'd finished reading the novel. And so I had time to really think about it, and I was like, yeah, this is the guy. This is the guy. And we did a chemistry read, which is really just a formality. We were just lucky that Johnny's schedule was free, and he had a...
Not that I knew that.
Somewhat free. He was working on like 4 different projects at one time at one point. But and it just... I think right from the get-go, we knew that it felt like the right formula for the show to serve the material in the best way, and we were lucky to have him.
The thing I remember is just the sort of mercurial energy that surrounded it. Even on a Zoom call, having met Dan Minahan, who was the director of episode 1 and 2 and exec produced with you, and seeing you talk about it with Ron Nicewinder, who wrote it, obviously. And there's just something that we've discussed over the last couple of days. It's been so lovely to return to talking about it. But there's just been this energy, hasn't there, that's sort of like pushed it forward. There's been something.
Not to sound too esoteric, but it really feels like the story was so much bigger than any of its singular parts. There were voices that really felt like they wanted to come through. We had a ton of roadblocks. It's so hard to get a miniseries made. It's so hard to get a period miniseries made. It's so hard to get an LGBTQIA plus period miniseries made. And then to also have people creatively who are members of the community to have some agency in that story makes it even harder sometimes. So we hit a lot of roadblocks along the way, but I think it was really Ron's passion for the story and his writing that carried the day. And also it felt like just voices that wanted to come through in this piece. So,
well, amid all those roadblocks, what were kind of the two of you doing to incentivize Showtime and the stakeholders to want to invest in the project?
I was taking every job that came my way and being like, hey, I have a job. You should really greenlight this so I don't take this job. And they were like, no, go do the job, man. That's cool. So I was like, not that they were jobs I didn't want to do necessarily, but I was like hoping that I was like going to be like really have some poker with it all, and it just all blew up in my face basically. And then I think thankfully Ron's scripts once they came in were just so beautiful. They were kind of undeniable, and we were really fortunate. You get these executives that are really restrictive in their notes and really want to curtail your creativity, and the folks at Showtime and Fremantle were like, no, go farther, embarrass yourself, scare yourself, make this next notes call hot and shameful with what you put forward in the writing. And I think it really gave the writers a sense of permission, and I really feel like that bled over into all the actors' scene work when we were working on it. But we did feel like we had this license to take creative risks. And I think that started with the folks at Showtime.
And also, what's amazing is that I feel like this probably, this couldn't have been made even 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, definitely not. And even, when you think about Showtime, that comes back to Ron working on Homeland. There's like you can trace so much work and relationships that have led to the gatekeepers saying yes to something like this. Matt's relationship with Dan Minahan.
And Dante and I did Normal Heart together.
Exactly. And Dante is an amazing mentor now, but there's been all these angels that have sort of said yes, and then when you do get something like this commissioned, they just go, and then it bleeds all the way through.
Yeah, that's a good point. I feel like Dan Minahan, I had worked with Dan on American Crime Story Versace and studied under him as a director, and I had a feeling once we got him involved, things really started moving, because we had someone at the helm who had such a specific vision for the palette of the show, the tone of the show, and was kind of the perfect shepherd for all of us to get the first 2 episodes up and running.
Just immaculate taste, Dan Minahan.
You guys could run this Q&A without me. You don't even need me here. You're doing such a great job.
It's because we know it's the last time we're going to talk about this. This is going to go on for 8 hours.
What I really like about this show is that while Hawk and Tim's romance begins in the 50s and, it carries through the decades, there's something that feels very modern about their relationship. Like if they had the language to talk about it, there's something even a bit, you would say it's a toxic relationship, at least in the beginning. And in some ways, Tim is sort of like almost like addicted to the rejection that keeps happening over the years. Was that part of the conversation at all to make this feel like a modern, relatable relationship, even in spite of the period surroundings?
Definitely not a conversation that was had, but it's interesting. I don't think it is a toxic relationship. I think in the context of the Lavender Scare, there is nothing that you could compare to. You definitely can't compare to the heteronormative relationships that gay men are afforded in our society now. I think that the point is that Hawk can survive, and the choices that he makes are just as valid as Tim's in life. And to me, that's what I felt, that it was a real exploration of power and how power used to oppress minorities and how that affects them. I think it's a privilege to look at that as a toxic, but I think they were really fighting for something that it should be pure, as Tim says, is a simple purity, and that is a love between 2 humans.
Yeah, I think as an actor, part of your job is to not, if you're in a period piece, is to not look at it through a modern lens so much, but to try to be subjective about it and to really find the given circumstances in the day-to-day life of the people in the period in which you live. It's always the temptation to do that, but I feel like even a couple years out, it's still hard for me to look at Hawk objectively. I feel like I still see him subjectively. He's a survivor who is trying to find a way to live and love and create his own personal freedoms in a world and a society and a family that told him he couldn't, he shouldn't, he didn't deserve to.
And in the hands of anyone else, I think just knockout, because at any point you can see the love that he has for Tim, I think, and the people around him, and you know exactly what he's thinking at every point, which is, I don't know how you did it.
Well, I think it's because what you brought is Tim, honestly. I mean, I'm going to throw that right back at you. Hawk doesn't work if Johnny didn't bring what he brought to Tim. I think he would be a character that would be really easy to revile. But I think, and I feel like that's one of the things the chemistry read was really valuable for, because I felt what you were bringing as Tim was complementary to what they had been encouraging me to try to do as Hawk. And so I think it was really symbiotic in a way. And if it hadn't been, it really wouldn't have worked at all. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, maybe toxic is the wrong word, but certainly they have to protect themselves in certain ways that end up hurting the other person, right?
Totally. And also, I think if that sort of relationship did exist now, which of course it does, it would definitely be, it's a wild thing to have someone so unavailable and, the survival. But no, I think you're right. And I think there's such pain about the fact that they never, I know you've just watched episode 8. And I realised that as we came in really jollily waving. And
oh gosh, I know. Oh, gosh.
But Hawk never has the words to say to Tim that I love you until the very end. And so, I think you can understand their choices, hopefully, but it is, it's a painful thing to see two characters, one overreaching and one, and causing pain and heartbreak along the way. Both of them do, but it's a dynamic between the two of them, and I think that's the toxicity. Is they're both complicit.
And moments of emotional unavailability is another word that we would use now. Yeah.
And there are modern reverberations of that as well. I mean, I feel like even growing up in semi-rural Texas, for me to just feel like I could survive high school, I had to kind of bifurcate my identity and deny certain parts of myself, because for me, it really felt like the stakes were that high for me. I'm not comparing that to the Lavender Scare by any means, but...
I think that's exactly what's so brilliant about a story. If you go 40 years back, you can really highlight nuances of today's society, and I think that's the genius of Ron taking the original source material, which was, I think it was all in the 50s, wasn't it, and then taking it through to the 80s and onwards, really, because there is a positive end to that. I think.
Yeah, it's beautiful and it's tragic that this man is 65 years old and just starting to step into his authenticity. And in the process of that, he lost the love of his life. Thank God he has his daughter with him. And when I read that, I was like, oh, thank God. I was upset because I was just so thankful that he had somebody by his side at the end of it all.
Yeah, and I'd love to know about the sort of day of the shoot of this kind of final scene that you two shared together outside the governor's ball. And there's that great line, "Promise me you won't write." It's very emotional and brings such wonderful closure to their relationship. And like Tim is able to say all these things that he's never been able to say before.
It's an interesting power switch, isn't it, in a way, too?
Totally. And also for two men who never really had the right words, they savor the words that they did have, and they remember, and they always recall back to very specific moments, don't they? They sort of... but yeah, that day was really... it was really sort of special, and we cross-shot it, so there were two cameras, and it sort of happened quite quickly and quietly, and there's so much, the crew there's just so many people who were just so invested in the story at that point, and in the writing, I think it was just so all the work had been done. These two men had lived their, the life, the moment, I always go to say a word and I never know how to describe it, but their cosmic sort of interplay comes to a conclusion there, and actually it was just the simplicity of saying the words, wasn't it?
It really was. It was really an unforgettable moment. It's a scene that I'll never forget being a part of. There was kind of a light snow happening, and the crew, we had this wonderful Canadian crew who were so invested in the story, and they all were just kind of like, all right, boys, this is the last one. And it's one of the last things we filmed, and I just remember, okay, it's one of those days as an actor, you're just trying to get out of your own way because the material is so good, and you have 8 hours of relationship that you've created with your fellow actor, and you have to just trust your instincts at that point. And I feel like what Johnny does in that scene is like a level 10 degree of difficulty, because it would have been so easy to lean into making it overly sentimental or pushing it away, and it was so strong and earned and beautiful that all I had to do was watch you and react, really.
Yeah, again, you guys could do this without me.
We're going to do a scene for you from episode...
Also, at the very end, Matt, looking at the AIDS quilt, when Hawk says he was the man I loved, I feel like even like the coldest of hearts could not resist that moment. It's very tear-jerking, but in an earnest way that doesn't feel overly sentimental. But anyway, that is you actually looking at that as the real AIDS quilt, right?
It is, yeah. I didn't know that we were going to have real squares from the quilt. That's probably the other scene that I'll take with me for the rest of my life. It was like really the honor of my life to get to share the screen with that quilt and pay tribute to that generation that we lost, whose shoulders we all stand on. And again, it was another one of those days where it was like, okay, don't overthink this. You've built 8 hours of this. You are here in this environment, and let that wash over you. This story is so much bigger than you are, whatever comes through in this scene. And it was such a surreal experience to be looking at the real Roy Cohn Square after we had 8 hours of history with him, and then obviously to see Tim Square was just, I mean, it still is moving. But yeah, it's an experience that I'll never forget.
I'd like to know, talk about structurally how, so in this episode, in addition to seeing like the final kind of moments between Tim and Hawk, we're in I think it's the late 60s after McCarthy's funeral, and they're sort of holed up in this pied-à-terre, and they have some of their most intimate moments, I think, that you see of each other, in the series. So talk about, the decision to put that in the last episode, and the ways that it kind of parallels what you're talking about at the very end.
And we shot it all in one day, I think, too. It was like a 20-hour day that day.
Sipping milk at 5 a.m.
Truly.
And not on the way to the airport, yeah. Yeah, I think the intimacy between the two of them was it's just like it always reflects something really sexual. I mean, it's just, I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're right. Psychosexual sounds right.
Sounds right.
Yeah, sounds right.
Yeah, it just it's how their bodies. What their bodies mean to each other as they evolve in that relationship is really fascinating, and the power shift. I think Tim is his strongest in the final episode in almost every part, because he comes back from the war and he there's a physical obvious switch in the way that they have sex, but he's completely aware of how he can sort of ensnare Hawk in that sequence, and I think it's really important to see that.
And Hawk is willing to sacrifice parts of himself to make sure that he gets to keep Tim as well. Bless you. Yeah, I mean, I feel like the writing was so good in all of those scenes, all the intimacy scenes we had. The characters are always different after the intimacy than they were before, and I feel like that's the mark of a really good intimacy scene. And I feel I had such a great scene partner who I could trust with anything. We knew we had each other's back in those scenes, and it was kind of one of the first times I didn't really dissociate in those kinds of scenes, and I could actually really think of them as an acting scene and be present with my scene partner. And so I feel like Ron did a really beautiful job setting the template, and then we were just given the freedom to also find spontaneity in those scenes as well, which is rare. Sometimes those things can feel really overly choreographed, and you may be too worried about your scene partner because you're not really sure. And I think that's one of the great benefits of having an intimacy coordinator these days, is that you can kind of have an intermediary who lets you know what your partner's boundaries are, and has breath mints if it's hour 20 and you've just drank 2 pints of milk, or or has deodorant or whatever you might need. But yeah, I think Ron really just gave us a great. I don't know. The writing of those scenes was so beautiful and poignant, and then it was just great to have Johnny.
As we remembered as well, that final scene, the milk at one point was a candle.
Yeah. Oh, there were all different iterations of. There was all kinds of talk about what their final intimacy scene was going to be.
Which goes to show just how important that is, as much as their final declaration of love at the end. And yeah, it was always the episode 8. I think we got a few weeks before we started filming it, so there was never any doubt, but just real excitement as to how Ron's sort of craft and how he can.
Oh, he had it all masterminded. It was like Tetris. He knew exactly. He had lived with this story so long. He knew exactly how he wanted to structure it and what he wanted to put where.
Yeah, I feel like milk is not what I want to be drinking if I'm like going into a scene like that. Yeah, it's like doesn't probably set you up for success necessarily.
They cut when we were taking the Lactaid, like right before that. They cut it out. I don't know why.
Well, you mentioned the intimacy coordinator as well, and that's that's become a hugely useful role in Hollywood on productions of all levels. But how much are you talking with this person in advance before filming, or is a lot of it happening like in real time during the production?
I think it varies on the job as well. I definitely had a conversation, I think, even before I got to Canada. It's one of the first things I think on a job like this where, it's as important as a medical almost, just to check in, and it was great. And, they literally do just say, is there anything that we need to know? It's obviously, in confidence, but you just don't know. There's so many things that someone could have experienced that might be triggering, or but with this and with Matt as well, and Matt is like the sublime leader in so many ways, and not just in talent, but in being able to sit, and when we met, we just to be able to go, we've got this, and we sort of knew we'd had enough experience in other stories of intimacy, and we'd also had probably too much experience of not seeing the stories that we wanted to tell. So the opportunity was to dive in, a swan dive together into it. And as a result of that, our relationship with the intimacy was something that at times felt very much like we could, in the security and safety of it, just to sort of go away and have a little chat and just think, and finding things in the moment as well. I think that's exactly what intimacy is about, especially between two people who otherwise aren't afforded a very simple sort of hand-holding in the street and an easier way. Everything is about listening, and it's on a molecular level and looking for the green light and the physicality of it. And so with that security, and only with Matt would you be able to do that, I think.
Yeah, I think we both felt a real responsibility to bring our own authenticity to it if we could. And those scenes were so important. I feel like in the 50s, those intimacy scenes are the freest that Hawk ever is in the 50s, sadly. But I constantly relied on Johnny. We would sidebar and go, okay, how can we make this better? What should we try? Should we?
You can do that if you want.
Et cetera, et cetera.
Wink twice if it's going to happen again.
Kinda. But yeah, no, it was really invaluable. And we just had talk about leadership. Ron Niswaner, this was his baby, this project. I think he's been with it for like a decade at this point, and was just so in love with these characters. He was there for every take of every scene we filmed, and he wasn't overly prescriptive, but just his presence there and his encouragement and his support, I think meant the world to both of us, really, and was really inspiring. I mean, he could have written any scene for that character and I would have done it, honestly, because his dedication to it was so pure and so true.
Well, this seems like a great place to end things. So, Matt and Jonathan, thank you both so much for joining us, and thank you all for staying back.